This is a film like no other. It tells the incredible story of a government turning its organs of state upon one of its own citizens for political expediency. It tells a disturbing story of political complicity and ruthless opinion manipulation against a young working-class woman who, as a result of her ordeal, is now confined as mentally ill and at serious risk of dying. Because it exposes such sensitive material, some of the contributors fear for their own welfare, and some have remained anonymous. Despite the risks, it is a story which has to be told. It is important to briefly set the scene. A 27-year-old Australian woman, Schapelle Corby, landed in Bali for a holiday, only to find 4.2 kilograms of marijuana in her bag upon collection. A nightmare began which is scarcely believable.
The value of marijuana in Indonesia is much lower than in Australia. There was no motive.
Schapelle is a non-drug user with no criminal record. She tested negative for everything.
They refused to weigh her luggage. If it was heavier than when she left, they would have had to release her.
She was illegally interrogated for 9 hours.
They refused to test the drugs for country of origin. If they were Indonesian, they would have had to free her.
They refused to DNA or fingerprint the evidence.
They refused to let her cross-examine customs officers.
They presumed guilt and not innocence, another breach of human rights.
They refused to seize CCTV footage from the airport, even when Schapelle begged for it.
They burned the evidence so it could never be used to free her.
The judge had never acquitted anyone in 500 cases.
They talked about sending a warning to other Australians, a clear political intervention.
The 20-year sentence was more than murderers, rapists and terrorists often get.
She will never have kids, never see them play, and will probably die in a filthy cell.
What happened next? While Schapelle Corby deteriorated in a squalid cell, her government clinically managed the political fallout of these events at her terrible expense. For the first time, this film exposes the reality of what has previously been hidden from the public. It exposes what happens when an individual's human rights conflict with strategic political need.
Governments sometimes have to take decisions based upon unfolding events. Back in 2005, the Schapelle Corby story was explosive. It was all over the media and was attracting comment by politicians in both countries. It was shaking the cultural divide and was beginning to create political friction and difficulty. Further, this was political difficulty between the two parties of a strategic relationship.
Corby case puts strain on Australian-Indonesian relationship. Losing the plot with Indonesia. Howard's Neighbourhood Watch. Relationships between the neighbours keep getting worse.
It is important to understand that Indonesia has the largest Muslim population in the world. Its relationship with the West is therefore of critical importance. Australia, by virtue of its geographical proximity, is the front line of that relationship. Australia's relationship with Indonesia is therefore of fundamental importance on the world stage. Yet here was a case involving a single young woman which was beginning to threaten that relationship, or at least cause increasing difficulty. There is absolutely no possibility that the case wasn't discussed by the Australian government. There can be no possibility that the government didn't discuss it and determine a position and policy on it. Not to do so would have been a blatant lack of due political diligence. The political hierarchy of Australia had to have a position and had to manage the case from a political perspective. I don't think that this can seriously be disputed.
Will Corby be the splinter in the Oz-Indon relationship? Australia and Indonesia in mortal danger. Australia-Indonesia relationship under severe strain. A dangerous gulf between nations. Diplomats put on backlash alert.
In terms of functionality, it would be the following. John Howard, the Prime Minister, Alexander Downer, the Foreign Affairs Minister, and Chris Ellison, Minister for Justice and Customs, who, of course, AFP Commissioner Keelty reported to. Those are the holders of the roles you would expect to be involved. Obviously, there would probably be others, too. Regardless, the outcome of the internal political debates which took place is clear enough. The government prioritized the strategic relationship with Indonesia ahead of Schapelle Corby and her human rights. At a purely political level, that is, of course, understandable. At an ethical, moral, and human level, it is frankly appalling.
In the case of Schapelle, it was decided early on by our government that in order not to offend Indonesia, in order to appease Indonesia, that they were willing to sacrifice an Australian citizen for the sake of political expediency.
And more.
The Schapelle Corby case arose just 2 years post 9/11. The impact of public focus on the huge-scale criminality at Australian airports would have created serious problems for the Australian government and its ministers. The impact of focus on the huge-scale criminality at Australian airports would have caused serious problems for commercial interests such as Qantas and the Sydney Airport Corporation Limited. An innocent Schapelle Corby would have created this focus.
Once a political decision is taken, once a policy is agreed upon, collective responsibility of government is established. This is the norm across nations and certainly not limited to Australia. All relevant organs of state will be supportively deployed. These include the ABC, the AFP, and others. Of course, ministers themselves swing behind the policy too. Once a political decision is taken, once a policy is determined, the organs of state are used to implement it. The heads of government agencies, like the AFP, report to politicians. Politicians create the national policies and set the agenda for the organs of state. This is entirely normal.
In 2010, a document emerged regarding Schapelle Corby, showing that orchestration across departments even included strict control of external communications.
Let's examine how each of the major government departments were deployed against Schapelle Corby.
Pick the time, fix the crime, it's political porn, let's make more money, more. What justice do you feel? She's fake game, caught in a bullshit deal. She's like having her eyes wide shut, her hands bound in the razor wire. She's like having her eyes wide shut, her hands bound in the razor wire.
When Schapelle Corby's lawyers pressed for information, Qantas Airways provided the total weights of her bags. Independent researchers cross-checked these against the maximum weight thresholds for her flight. Schapelle Corby's bags were found to be 5 kilos overweight on the Qantas system, but she had checked them in underweight. No excess charge had been levied. According to the records, 5 kilos have been added to her official weight after check-in. Neither Qantas, the AFP, or the government ever provided Schapelle Corby this vital information. Hidden World Films informed her family in 2011.
It's important to set the context. Here we had a young Australian woman before a foreign court whose life depended upon a very credible defense that drugs were placed in her bag by corrupt airport baggage handlers. There was a significant amount of evidence to support that. But suddenly, just a few weeks before the verdict, the head of the Australian Federal Police told the media that, quote, "There is very little intelligence to suggest that baggage handlers are using innocent people to traffic heroin or other drugs between states," end quote. In itself, that was staggering. Its timing could not have been worse, and its impact on Schapelle Corby was devastating. The president of Law Council of Australia himself felt moved to comment on this. Quote, "It was potentially damaging to the Corby defense, as it will no doubt be transmitted to Bali," end quote, with Schapelle Corby's lawyer referring to it as, quote, "an absolute disgrace," end quote. But with the advantage of hindsight, we can also now see that it made no operational sense either. In fact, it totally contradicted what was actually happening on the ground, so much so that many suggest that it was a political statement engineered by the government. For a start, the AFP, via an operation known as